So there are these stories. Both peoples continue on. Life goes on, we've learned. But it is a setback. But the debate that is being had in Jenin today about the loss of Giuliano Mirhamis, it's quite amazing to hear people like Zachariah Zubeidi and former Al-Aqsa Brigade members talking about their friend, the Israeli, who used to come, and how they have to free their minds before they can be free and have, even without a state, they've got to continue this tradition of that the theater had begun. So there's a lot there's a lot of tragedy, but there's also, we did come away with a lot of hope, and it's why we wrote the book.
I'll just add one very quick word to that. If we'd been total pessimists, we would have just walked away and not bothered with the book.
That's true.
And it's because we met so many genuinely good people. I'm not sort of saying that as any sort of platitude. Just extraordinary people who are trying to find a way out and try to find a solution. That's the one thing that gives you hope, even if it is not all that, doesn't look all that positive at the moment.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Ann Rutherford, and I was just wondering that Israel was created by a UN decree, and why do you think the Israel feels, or they're objecting to Palestine being recognized by the UN?
There's a lot of contradictions in the Middle East, and this is going to be a very interesting. Israel has never felt. As you rightly point out, there was the partition plan of 1947 called for a Jewish homeland, the state of Israel, and that even though it was not accepted, and all that led very much to the formation of the state of Israel in 1948. Basically, since then, Israel has always felt that it did not get a fair shake at the United Nations, that it's automatically outvoted, and that whatever resolution is Arab countries and other allied countries ganging up on them. But I think we may be seeing this very interesting development where you can almost look at it, in stages where for decades the Palestinians felt the only way they were going to make progress was by fighting or attacking Israel. In the 90s, they felt that we could negotiate a solution, and now saying the negotiations aren't working either. Maybe we'll go through international diplomatic support at the United Nations and through a General Assembly resolution. Again, as I understand it, that's it would be passed in the General Assembly, a Palestinian statehood. Would not have to go through the Security Council. Again, I'll stand corrected on the details here, but that's my understanding. And that
seems to be the strategy right now, is for the Palestinians to take the issue to the General Assembly in September. It's why Shimon Peres was here yesterday, I believe, talking to the White House. There's great concern, and Greg has a line in the book where you talk about, what was it, BDS?
It's certainly the Israelis. You'll have to ask the Israelis about why they would, be opposed to that. But the thing that struck me recently is, I'll hear these Israeli diplomats talking about BDS. BDS, what is that? It's boycotts, divestment, and sanctions. So militarily, you look at Israel, and the first quarter century they fought 4 conventional wars from 48 to 1973. And then it became clear that Arab countries were not going to defeat Israel in a traditional war. So then you saw a move to terrorism, to asymmetric warfare, suicide bombings, rocket attacks. That really hasn't worked either. I think that the Palestinians are going to be looking at this kind of approach now and building international support, which they've done well. The Latin countries that have expressed support for a Palestinian state. And so the Israelis are very, very worried about that internationally, and even in the U.S. I think they've very much taken notice of the different atmosphere on college campuses now, where there's a lot of you see a lot more support for Palestinians and a lot more criticism of Israelis Israel and Israeli policies on college campuses. And I know the Israeli diplomats in this country are making a big effort to sort of combat that. So I think Israel recognizes that this is going to be their next big battle. It's not going to be so much with tanks or airplanes. It's going to be on this diplomatic level.
And you could argue that the Israelis won the Intifada. Their economy kept going, their society kept going. The Palestinians, and we talk about this with Zachariah Zubeidi, having declared that the Intifada had failed the Palestinians. You have this bifurcated state where, I mean, not state, non-state, but with the leaders of Hamas ruling Gaza, and you have the Palestinian leadership in the West Bank. But what we've seen in the Middle East, and we've seen in recent times in other countries going through these revolutions that we're seeing right now, is that you can't leave situations unresolved. For 30, 40 years in many of these Arab capitals, you left tyrannical rulers in power. The Arab street has been seething for a long time, and all it took was a fruit seller in Tunis to set himself on fire and a human rights activist to be arrested in Benghazi, and you have places going up in flames. We were there on September 28th, 2000, when Ariel Sharon, I was standing at the foot of the Temple Mount when Ariel Sharon took those fateful steps on the Temple Mount. And while that may not have been the only cause of the Intifada, there were many, many reasons that the Intifada was launched. You can see how these very simple acts can become sparks for something larger. So you can't leave the situation unresolved, but what we want to show in this book is how the psychological and physical landscape changed in 10 years, and how you can't dust off the roadmap to peace or Camp David Accords or Taba Accords. You can't not take into account how the psychology and physical landscape changed if you're going to go back and try and attack and find a solution for this problem. And we certainly believe that there should be a solution to this problem. We just don't want it to be a naive sort of dusting off of same old language, same old attempts to divide things up.
Thank you. There seems to be a couple different planes operating right now, and in Israel and with the Palestinians. First of all, May 14, 1948, Israel became a nation, and the next day they were attacked by 5 Arab countries. 1967, Nasser and Assad told the world that they were going to destroy Israel. They're going to drive them into the Mediterranean. But Israel hit first and was successful. Then the Yom Kippur War in 73. So I think when you look at things, Israel's not perfect, but at the same time, they just want to be left alone to be a productive country, which they certainly have become. That's one factor. And the other factor, too, is the Palestinians. I met a lot of Palestinians. They are wonderful people. There are some neat Palestinians that live here in Washington. And I think their leadership has really done them a lot of injustice. And plus, you also know, throughout a lot of Middle Eastern countries, Palestinian refugees are treated as second, third-class citizens. So in a lot of ways, the Palestinian leadership is also responsible for what they are dealing with today.
I think what's interesting right now as we look at the broader Middle East is that in capitals where for 30 years they blamed all of their problems on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the fact that it wasn't resolved and that Israel was responsible for everything that was wrong in these Arab capitals, you haven't heard a peep from the Arab street about the Israelis or about Assad has tried in Syria to turn it back to the Israelis and say that they're provoking these protests. But in general, what's really refreshing is seeing that the street isn't buying it anymore. They're looking at their own leaders and saying, why don't we have any rights? Why are you so corrupt? Why have we had the same family ruling us and the same cronies ruling us for 30, 40 years? The same thing's going to happen in the Palestinian areas. And one thing we saw during this Intifada and what we document is how the disappointment with the Yasser Arafat's and his cronies, but that translated into, when you had elections there, that translated into Hamas. And that hasn't really gone too well for people.